Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Morphew, and I'm Dean of the School of Education at Johns Hopkins, and I want to welcome you to the third in a series of 5 webinars we're calling Impossible or Imperative, that focuses on reopening America's schools. Today's is, as I said, the third in our series, and it's a session we're calling More Than Buildings, Reforming Policy for Today's Schools. Before we get started, for some background on what we're going to be talking about today, let's take a look at how COVID-19 has affected our schools, and some of the images you'll see next give a nice portrayal of that. Again, welcome to our discussion today on More Than Buildings, Reforming Policy for America's Schools. Last week in our session, we focused on equity issues as it related to COVID-19 and reopening schools. That discussion on some of the historical inequities associated with schooling really opened our eyes to some of the ways in which COVID-19 has become an even more challenging environment for issues and challenges around equity. This week, we're going to dig a little deeper, and we're going to be focusing on the functions of schools that we talk less about, and some of us think less about. Schools today are more than buildings. They are multifaceted, incredibly complex organizations that play a lot of different roles in students' lives. And today, our guests are going to be talking about how schools are, in fact, more than just buildings. Today's schools are, in fact, formative social environments for learners from diverse backgrounds. Today's schools are safe, welcoming spaces where children are taught to learn and function in a complex society. Today's schools are vital centers for identifying and addressing trauma and mental health issues. And today's schools are places where students receive positive motivation and behavioral health and much more. As the nation, by necessity, becomes more and more aware of these wide-ranging and complex roles that schools play in students' lives and communities, we have to ask ourselves, how can we make these priorities clearer, and what is COVID-19 and the pandemic going to do in terms of challenging these roles? Today we've invited some of the nation's top experts on school transformation, policy translation, and social and emotional learning to discuss our topic, which is, again, More Than Buildings, Reforming Policy for Today's Schools. Let me start by introducing our panelists. I'll start with Robert Balfance. Bob is a research professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Education, and he is the director of our Everyone Graduates Center here in the School of Education. He's also the co-founder of Diplomas Now, which is an evidence-based school transformation model with broad implementation in dozens or hundreds of schools around the country. His ongoing research focuses on translating that findings into effective school intervention. Thanks for being here, Bob. Next, we have Monica Kincheloe. She joins us from America's Promise Alliance, where she works closely with a range of national, state, and community organizations to connect and synthesize research, practice, and policy on education and well-being for young people. Monica has also served as a lead program officer for the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you for being here, Monica. And finally, especially relevant to a discussion on the expansive, complex role in today's schools, please welcome Robert Jagers, Vice President of Research at the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, better known as CASEL. Rob leads CASEL's work with partner districts on leveraging social and emotional learning to promote equitable learning environments and outcomes for students from historically underserved groups. So thanks for joining us today, Rob, as well. And to our audience, thank you for being here. We're going to try to engage you in as interactive a session as possible. Let me start with a few guidelines about our discussion. I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists a single question, and we'll listen to their responses. Then I'll be directing a series of prepared and reactive questions to the entire group. There is going to be an opportunity early on for you to engage in this discussion. We want you to join in. You can submit questions by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll start with audience questions about halfway through the discussion and get to as many as possible. You'll note that you can upvote the questions of your audience cohort as you see questions that we want to make sure that we pay attention to. So do use that Q&A button. Take a look at what your cohort is suggesting in terms of question, and upvote those questions that you think are the most interesting to you. So welcome. Let's get started. I'll start, Rob, with a question to you. In my introduction, as part of your work at Castle, we talked about your expertise and work around social and emotional learning. And let's start by framing the discussion here. So much of the learning that takes place in today's schools is vital to success in life, but it's often overlooked in how we measure and how we talk about learning. What are some of the major social and emotional learning issues that schools are tackling today?
So first of all, thank you very much, Dean, for including me in this panel, and my appreciation and gratitude to fellow panelists as well. So clearly these are important conversations that you're having. You set the context by talking about pre-existing inequities and how the current pandemic and other social issues, the social unrest we're experiencing, have exacerbated these pre-existing inequities. And so some of the issues that we are confronted with now have to do with our initial framing of the need for systemic social and emotional learning. By systemic, that we mean the links between state policy and district policy practices and approaches, how that impacts schools and school districts and schools within districts and classrooms within schools. So it's a nested set of considerations that we understand to be important, and any lack of alignment makes it more complex to effectively impact on the quality of educational experiences for young people, especially those furthest from opportunity. We often think in terms of, historically, we've thought in terms of the assessment of young people's social and emotional competencies. And especially for young people furthest from opportunity, that typically has led to conversations about gaps or lags or the need to fix, quote unquote, the young people, rather than a focus on the ways in which adults in those settings can help provide context in which optimal learning can occur. And so our work has really tried to think very carefully about, from a systemic social and emotional learning perspective, how we can also layer in assessments of context, both at the state, district, school, and classroom levels, with a particular focus on student experiences, because ultimately the teaching and learning process, whether it's academic, social, or emotional learning that's being enacted, is predicated upon the engagement of young people and the capacity of educators closest to them to help them wrestle with the content that's being delivered.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate those comments. We'll get back to those. You raised a couple of issues in there. We'll get back to with some follow-up questions. Bob Belfence, I'd like to follow up with you. In my introduction to you, I talked about your research agenda focusing on translating findings into effective school interventions. You spent a lot of time, obviously, doing that work. As schools are moving into online and hybrid roles, what are some of the successful interventions you've seen that have addressed some of the social and emotional learning issues that Rob has pointed out to us?
Thanks, Chris. And we're glad to be here today and with our panelists. What we've really seen is that schools have figured out a way to keep kids connected to schooling, even when schooling is remote. They've been able to deal with a lot of the social emotional challenges you highlighted in the beginning. And this research on school connectedness actually comes out of the field of public health. Actually, Bob Bloom at our School of Public Health has done the pioneering work here. And if we go to the first slide, or to my slide, what they found is that kids are connected to school when 4 things happen, and all 4 things have to be true. They have to believe that adults in the school know and care about them as a person, right? So many kids at high school that gets connected say, I left school because no one knew, no one cared, right? And if you feel that no one knows about you, no one cares about you, what is your motivation to be there? But it's also important to have a supportive peer group, right? Especially adolescents live for their peers, and that disconnection from peers you could see in your opening, and many things you've heard is a thing that kids are really missing and really feeling, right? Just as many of us adults are cut off from our colleagues. The third thing is kids are connected when they're engaged in pro-social activities that they view as meaningful, and in this idea that whatever they're doing is not just for themselves, but helping others. And we often are surprised for this, especially among adolescents. We think it's sort of like they're all consumed by themselves. But it turns out they really actually work harder when they feel what they're doing is helping somebody else. And then finally, this idea, they see school as a welcoming place, a place where they're wanted, a place not that cares, as opposed to a place that sort of, unless you do this, then we don't like you. It's a place that accepts them for who they are and welcomes them for who they are and just welcomes them as a member of their community. Now you can see, and when schooling goes remote, this all becomes highly challenging. But some schools are figuring it out. So New York City community schools had a group of mentors that they were using to address chronic absenteeism. They repurposed them to do 2 things: to use their existing relationships with these kids who knew they were supportive, to one, talk to the kids and their parents to make sure they had what they needed as far as technology and connections to participate in schooling. And then secondly, they followed up every week to make sure the kids are able to get their assignments done, right? And so they made that pivot to give one-to-one supports to kids to sort of stay engaged in schooling. Other places have figured out how to have kids themselves, and often the kids themselves initiated this, to create tutoring corps and technology support corps. And that both gives them that pro-social activity and that peer network. And then finally, we're working with a group of middle schools in places like Milwaukee and Tulsa and other places, which are trying to use the first few weeks of school to focus on 3 things: belonging, resilience, and engagement. And believing that's the precondition for more academic learning to follow, given all that we've done. And one of the key things they're trying to do is create a common shared narrative that we're all in this together. That the pandemic is hard, it's challenging, everyone is experiencing differently, but the idea is that we're all in this together, we can work through it together, and creating that common narrative that creates that sense of belonging, as opposed to everyone sort of off on their own trying to do the best they can. So those are some examples how schools have been able to figure out how to keep this connection going, even when schooling is remote.
Thanks, Bob. Now, Monica, it's your turn. Thanks for being here. In my introduction, I talked about your expertise in connecting research, policy, and practice for states and communities. As you interact with state and community organizations, are you seeing any emerging socio and emotional learning issues that are gaining traction and being considered more broadly?
Sure, thanks, Dean. Appreciate the invitation to be here with 2 giants in the field, and just appreciate all the audience here for being here as well in these very strange times. So I think what I'm seeing from communities at America's Promise, and we work really closely primarily with about 20 communities, is what Boston has really latched onto is this notion of Maslow before Bloom. The pandemic has really shed a lot of light on the role that schools play. It's much more than academics, as you opened with. And so schools and their partners, community-based partners, have to rise to this challenge of meeting Maslow's hierarchy, frankly: food, shelter, connection through Wi-Fi, sense of belonging and connection, before they really feel like they can make any inroads on the academic rigor that we have come to hope for and expect from schools. So another wise focus I think we're seeing is a focus on adult SEL. So this notion that the pandemic is happening not just to young people, but to the adults as well, and to youth serving adults. And so we have to pay much closer attention to how we're using our time and our staffing capacity to meet the needs of the adults in the Zoom room. And so what that means is creating space and structure for the adults, for educators to process what's happening with them and in their own lives, and how that might be intersecting with their ability to support young people through this difficult time. So I want to share just a couple pieces of data that I think really support what the previous two panelists spoke to. And we at America's Promise are really rooted in this idea that we have to start with understanding where young people are coming from. And so we conducted a nationally representative survey of high school aged young people back in April. So this was really at the beginning of the pandemic, but I think it's illustrative of how difficult things have been for young people. And because school is no longer in a building and in a locus of control that educators have previously enjoyed, we have to understand what young people's mindsets are wherever they are. And so wanted to share just some data here that really underscores the idea that young people are also more concerned right now with Maslow before Bloom. As you can see, over half are more concerned than usual about health, their family finances, their own educational pathways, and this includes post-secondary options. And about a third are just more concerned about basic needs like food and shelter. But the good news is, and this is why we have to focus on adults, the good news is that when adults are offering support, social and emotional supports, it is helpful. So just 60% of the young people we surveyed said that they were receiving some type of emotional, social or emotional support. But of the ones that received it, over 90% found it helpful. So I think this is reassuring. We need to sort of continue to extend those opportunities for these virtual connections and supports. But the last piece that I want to add here is it's really about leveraging partnerships, because schools can't do this alone when we were in person pre-COVID, and they certainly can't do it alone now that we're virtual. So if we go to the next slide, just want to share, and again, this is really in alignment with what's already been spoken to. This is in a pre-COVID world. We interviewed over 100 high school age young people who were in what we might call integrated social, emotional, cognitive settings that don't look at learning as just academic or just rote learning, but are really focusing on the 6 items on this slide. And I think our challenge in COVID reopening is to adapt these characteristics of a youth-centered learning environment to the virtual setting. And so that's our challenge, and to be able to do that at scale and in a situation where Maslow is really taking priority.
Thank you, Monica. You know, in the first round of answers to these questions, there's a number of things that I want to explore. You know, Monica just gave us the Maslow before Bloom colloquialism here that schools are using, which I think is really intriguing. And I want to go back to Bob Balfans to ask him a question about that. Is, Bob, you've done a tremendous amount of work around the Maslow piece of this, right? As you gave us in your first answer to my question. What have you found to be the challenges as you are promoting as Monica was just saying, a sort of basic needs before children can learn? They actually have to feel safe. They have to feel like they belong. They have to have peer networks. All of these pieces that you've highlighted in your work. Is that, do you think the COVID-19 environment is actually going to make that that description, that the Maslow before Bloom, easier to sell, if you will, easier to understand for people? Is that something that's going to stay with us post-pandemic?
I do, because I think that's always been there, but we've always sort of put that in the background and put sort of academics, how we just more generally define them, in the foreground. And what COVID has done for both teachers and parents and students about is really made the other side paramount, that connection side, that need side. Parents see it in their own kids. They see the depression, the anxiety, the cutoff from peers. They see that, teachers see that with the kids. They experience it with their own kids. So I really think that lived experience of how important these connections are, which are always sort of in the background, that they need sort of some more equality in the foreground, I think will be easier, because I think everyone's had a really rapid thrown into the pond and figure out how to swim exposure with how important those are, and how they're not just nice, but they're really necessary. And one stat that Monica didn't show that comes from her data is, there's at least a quarter of kids who reported themselves being disconnected from schooling in April. There's at least a quarter of the kids who report, as your slide show, all kinds of, depression, anxiety, can't sleep. When people see that at that magnitude, they see the importance.
So Rob, if Bob is right here, and these elements that his research have shown and Monica just portrayed in her slides, if these elements of socio-emotional learning are not just nice, but they're actually essential to kids learning and thriving in school environments. You're VP for research at Castle. What do you think is the essential research that can be done or should be being done right now in this environment to provide us with the links between those things that Bob and others haven't already done?
Right. So I think my co-presenters hit on a number of those issues. I think the emphasis on adult well-being is essential to understand. Historically, I think the field of social and emotional learning has really been built on randomized controlled trials and proof of concept work. I think now we need to attend to what works for whom under what circumstances, meaning we might need a much more nuanced approach to understanding influences and impacts on adults as well as young people. Continuous improvement, I think, is, in addition to adult social and emotional learning, issues of continuous improvement or liberatory design, as some of my colleagues would frame it, to better understand how we can continuously support adult and student development in ways that is co-designed and co-constructed, meaning all of the stakeholders have voice and choice inside the effort to create fertile learning environments in which both adults and young people thrive. And so a continuous improvement approach, I think, is warranted. Historically, we spent a lot of time with summative evaluation, right? So accountability has been the frame that we've used. I think going forward, we need to think much more clearly about processes and how to support human growth and development, both at the level of young people and the level of adults.
Thanks, Rob. Monica, coming back to you, America's Promise Alliance, I think, very intentionally uses youth-centered rather than student-centered or learner-centered to describe the kind of work that you think is most important here. How can state and district policies support schools creating this youth-centered learning environment that support these positive relationships, a sense of belonging and trust, all of the pieces of this?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, because I think it is a critical piece of this. Young people are not just students. They exist in many settings and with many different kinds of people, peers and adults. And so I think one way that we have to think about all of this is that school buildings in many parts of this country are sort of meaningless at the moment, in the sense of that's not where young people are congregating and can be sort of appropriately channeled to various classes. So there's two big constituencies of adults that have to stay engaged and have to be considered equal partners at this point when it comes to education and growth and development of young people. I think the first is parents and families, and then the second is a range of out of school time supports and providers. And this really includes a range of healthcare professionals and after school, before school programming. I'm going to just sort of bring in some real talk as well to say that parents and families are under a lot of stress, and we don't have to look too far at unemployment figures and the housing crisis, rent crisis we're about to enter to know that parents and families are under immense stress. And so if they are now the leaders of young people's learning environments, that's a group that needs to be supported in some way and held up. And I think that's a hard, tough order to put on schools, but policymakers need to be attuned to that and identify the appropriate channels to get those support, to get some kind of support, because I think it's in high demand out there. And then the last piece is just around those out of school time providers. I think a lot of them are moving to virtual programming the best they can. But I think the real talk there as well is they have suffered incredible layoffs, and many of the communities we work with are reporting that they simply just don't have access to as many people to support young people that they had pre-COVID.
So, Monica, a couple of things you hit on there that I'd like to get Bob's input on. You mentioned before and after school programs, and in our video montage that launched this today, you saw a couple quotes there. You saw a band performance. I think there was a quote about sports. And, you know, the things, Bob, that you led off with, sense of belonging, trusted adult, does someone care about my success? For some kids, that occurs in extracurriculars.
Yep.
And it doesn't occur in the classroom, right?
Yep.
So you've got coaches, you've got band leaders, you've got, activities leaders before and after school. As Monica was just pointing out, those things are canceled now, right? And we've moved to virtual for some of those things, and others have just simply gotten canceled. How do you replace that in many cases, that that small group or that one-on-one kind of relationship that kids get through extracurriculars? What should schools be doing, or what should communities be thinking about in order to replace that?
Well, I think the key thing is to recognize is that for almost all of those, and the one exception I would say is like team sports, but many other things, debate, drama, other kinds of athletic activities, music, chorus, folks have found out ways, and it's not a substitute, but it's still enough that's worth doing to do this online. So one example is that some theater departments have rediscovered and redone old-fashioned radio plays, right, which were all designed to be done just by voice and sound effects, not actually interacting. Other folks have like, there's esports leagues, right, that do sports virtually online. It's not the same, but it has many of the same characteristics. You could form teams, you could have competitions, you could have practices. Other folks have found ways to actually do chorus and band, right? It takes a fair amount of work by a very dedicated band or chorus director and some technology. But they also found ways just to do it in quartets and things like that are a little more manageable. The main challenge is that for that to happen, the structures of the system have to give those people support, encouragement, structures, and time in the day to do it. Many of the online schedules that come out, right, are designed to be, we have our instruction and then you're off on your own. And they're not investing in saying we should have time built into our schedule for these electives, for these after school activities. And some districts have done that. They have a 2 to 4 p.m. block where it occurs. So it's both recognizing a lot of this can be done, at least to some degree, but also that the structures have to be built to enable it.
Thanks, Bob. I'll remind the audience that there's an opportunity here. We want this to be interactive, so do use that Q&A button. And if you see something in the chat that you think is interesting, please weigh in on that question. Let's move to one of our questions we've gotten already here. And let me, Rob, I'll ask you to weigh in on this. Maybe give me Castle's perspective on this based on your work there. School programs are being cut and losing funding during this time, many of which provide those caring adults that are necessary for student connectedness. Have you seen any community organizations fill those roles without discrediting the necessity of these programs existing in school? And I think part of the question there is about, is there some danger here in sort of schools being displaced? What's the sort of trade-off here as we see community organizations maybe stepping into the void here when schools can't do some of the things they're doing?
Right. I think that, I think Monica in particular has alluded, and Bob as well, has alluded to some of the ways in which school communities are responding to the current current crisis. And when framed as a collective enterprise in support of young people, I think we can understand ourselves as simply doing what is necessary in the current context to ensure the best quality educational or developmental experiences possible for young people. It is the case that some of what we're confronting right now, it's unclear. Like we don't have visibility into how this evolves over time. And so some might say we are experiencing a new normal. Optimistically, we could, imagine going back to what was known as school and the kind of divisions we had between K-12, the K-12 school building space and out of school time programs, et cetera. And certainly with family and community involvement in authentic and meaningful ways. We could imagine that as one possibility, but it's also possible that we will continue to have to reimagine a way in which we can ensure that our young people get opportunities to explore their interests and cultivate their talents. And so, it's an evolving process that I think, we all would are better together than we are thinking in terms of the divisions between us.
Thanks, Rob.
Chris,
yeah,
I have a thing to add to that. There actually is a bill currently in Congress to try to expand Americorps, which is lets recent college grads do a year of sort of national service. And that's the thing we have to think about as sort of a win-win, because there's a lot of concern about will there be jobs for recent college graduates because of the economy. And at the same time, our schools are hurting for tutors, mentors, post-secondary transition advisors. And it could be a real win to sort of send a recent college graduates and significant numbers into schools to provide the person power to build the relationships, to do the tutoring, to give the guidance as a way to sort of, fill some of that void that's been created by, individual local funding crises.
So I think that's a great point. I think that's a great point, Bob. Thanks for pointing that out. Monica, in thinking about this, I've got two K-12 students at home. There are a lot of parents that are probably listening to this conversation, among others, and wondering about the mental health and of their own kids. Right, we're sort of watching as our kids, express their anxiety about what's going on around them, and they're not getting that. They're not getting that interaction with their peers. What's your advice to parents out there around their own children and their mental health as they sort of watch us go into what may be another full year of remote learning? What can parents be doing, or what should parents do? I think, as Bob pointed out, I think a lot of parents are looking into sort of learning pods and things like that. But on the SEL side of the equation, what are some things parents could be doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an important question, and as a parent myself, can certainly relate to it being a very difficult year. So I think I'd start by saying, let's not question whether it's happening. Let's almost assume that the social isolation is impacting young people, and let's work with that. I think so. I don't think I shared it in this slide deck, but in addition to the data I shared, we learned very clearly that up to a third of Black and white students and almost 40 to 50% of Latinx and Asian students are reporting poorer emotional health. And this includes things like anxiety and depression. So it's not to say that the rest of the young people in the survey aren't experiencing anything. I think that there's a range of reaction that an individual young person might report. So that being said, the way I really look to our partner in San Francisco, who's working very closely with parents and families through this time. And, there's age appropriate responses for each, for sort of younger kids, middle school age kids, and high school students. I think when I think about high school age students, a lot of it is giving them autonomy and some parameters, really leaning into what we know about brain development during adolescence, which is this is an opportunity for them to maybe pursue, music or using the many apps that are out there and learning how to code or game or something, you know, it's an opportunity for them to pursue some interests in creating space and allowing for that, but also talking to them about it. I think parents, maybe we relied on busy schedules before and we can't do that now that we can't go as many places. So bringing that inward and creating those opportunities at home is really critical. Also put us all on the hook. Like, they should be running errands and they can maybe get groceries too and help unload and cook and all that good stuff. So some of it is a little bit of substituting for what you can do at home. I think for younger kids, these pods are really interesting. I know that there's also a lot of concern that they're going to exacerbate inequities because not all young people have parents at home who can help coordinate that and make sure there's a safe place to engage in that pod-based learning. So I think that there's, you know, pros and cons to that when you think about scale. And so I think those are some of the things we've heard are happening. A lot of this actually is understanding how difficult teaching and learning actually is, and then parents kind of appreciating or trying to get up to speed, I should say, on some of that developmental psychology behind learning and bringing it into their homes.
Yeah, I think a number of us, Monica, I think a number of us are trying to get our kids outdoors, and you know, I think there's a realization that getting out and doing some little hiking or getting in the outdoors is wonderful. I think the suggestion about sending the kids out for groceries is probably a good idea for some of us too. We should reconsider things like that. Assuming the kids can drive, of course, right? If they're old enough to do those things, or walk to the store, I suppose. So we're getting some more questions from the audience, so keep them coming. Let me get to a couple of those. This one is for Rob. Rob, does CASEL have an outreach division that could assist individual schools in facilitating parent workshops on SEL?
We have, I guess you would call a practice unit. Mostly, CASEL is organized largely into a couple of venues. We have a collaborating states initiative, a collaborating districts initiative, and a lot of our support goes into those districts. There also are opportunities to connect directly via a school district, less so in terms of schools. The other thing I will say is that we are, through a couple of different funded projects that we're doing, we are placing a particular emphasis on authentic parent engagement with an eye towards kind of a parent participatory evaluation work strand, so that parents can be informed and deeply engaged in the process of monitoring via data what is happening in their home as well as in the school community. And so that's emerging work that I think we're going to be able to share out more broadly in the coming year or so.
Thanks, Rob. So Monica, a question about some of the data you shared earlier and maybe future data. The data you showed, I think, was from a study you conducted in April. What other research projects are in the works to study the effects of COVID-19 on students, teachers, and schools? And what can we look forward to seeing in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, good question. So we have sorry, let me back up and say, I shared findings from a qualitative review and a quantitative review. So on the quant side, in terms of, surveying large groups of young people, we have 2 surveys in the works. One will be really rooted in youth employment, because I know that's not the focus particularly of this session, but that we're also watching the data to see in anticipation, frankly, of a youth employment crisis. We know that the summer was really difficult in terms of transitioning to virtual internships and things like that. Many of them were canceled. And so that work experience that really facilitates the post-secondary transition is also being impacted by COVID. So that is in the works to come out sometime this academic year, probably in the spring. And then we have another survey that is in very early development under the banner of our Grad Nation campaign, which will sort of dig in a little deeper on following up on some of these SEL questions that we posed in April, but then adding in some more academic focused questions in terms of how academics went in the fall semester, and a little bit of forecasting in terms of post-secondary plans in terms of like 2 and 4 year college, in addition to any like apprenticeship or other types of training programs.
Thanks, Monica. So Bob, you've been immersed in this work for decades, and I think this is, there are many of us who are optimistic, or maybe hopeful is a better word of saying, that this pandemic is going to require schools, districts, states to innovate in ways around some of these topics that we're going to figure out actually works and have some traction, things that are going to hang on post-pandemic. If you were to look into your crystal ball, and maybe a hopeful crystal ball, what do you think sort of post-pandemic, as we get back to what is a new normal? What are you hopeful that we learn, and that maybe we try and we learn as a result of the pandemic that sticks in schools?
Yeah. So one thing that we've really observed, and we're working with 75, 80 high schools across the nation right now in reform efforts, is that those that really had invested pre-pandemic in sort of a relationship-based schools, where they put premium on building strong student-teacher, student-student, teacher-teacher relationships and trust, and had that sort of continuous improvement outlook that Rob talked about, were able to be very adaptive under COVID, and in some cases, like, barely missed a beat. I mean, they reorganized their schedules, they kept doing their work, they kept trying and figuring stuff out. They didn't just say, we're overwhelmed, we can't do anything but the basics. And some of these schools were in some of the most impacted places. One was in Queens, one was in Gallup, New Mexico, where actually their auditorium was turned into a field hospital because it's right at the border of the Navajo Nation. So there was a set of schools that could take a very unexpected and hard shock and keep driving through it. And they had that relationship-centered and sort of continuous improvement outlook. And another set of schools that were more traditional and basically driven by systems and structures. Now there's a system in place, there's a structure, we got our roles, and they were very brittle. I mean, some of them just like ran into the ground almost. I mean, they just like, all they could do is give packets to kids, and almost, one half step from shutting down. So I think one thing we're going to take out from this is that, and there's some work to sort of catalog this now and show there was a sort of a more widespread phenomena, that again, some of these things people thought were nice but not necessary, but really having this based on relationships where we know and we work together collectively. It's not just everyone with a narrow hierarchical role. And also this idea of constantly recognizing we don't have the answers, and we always have got to keep trying things and studying and analyzing and doing it, puts you in much better shape to anticipate shocks than if, like, we have our ways, we have our rules, we have our systems, and they are what they are. So that's what I'm really hopeful, is that more emergent way will have a body of evidence that said it's a much stronger way to operate a school.
Yeah, part of what I hear you describing, Bob, is akin to what your colleague Joyce Epstein talks about in partnership schools, right? Building that partnership with parents and communities, yep. and that's the flexible arrangement, yep. where you've built a real community school,
right.
Where you understand the needs of your community. And as you said, I think that's less brittle during these times. So Rob, Bob has mentioned that how some schools are working to address socio-emotional learning for students. But we've heard a couple times from this discussion about adult well-being as well. What about the adults? What do you think schools should be doing to support adult well-being as students head back to school? And what would research into that area? What kind of research do we need into that area in terms of adult well-being?
I think that pre-pandemic, there was a couple of bodies of literature that are instructive. One had to do with how to ameliorate some of the typical stressors that educators experienced as a function of the normal course of work, a high demand, often under-resourced effort. And you could see in the current context, in some ways, our educators are thought of as essential workers who must go back to ensure that the institution of schooling continues on. So, so that there's that. Then, as Monica pointed out, there are all of the stresses associated with going through the pandemic and the social unrest that we're also experiencing. And so that has another layer, I think, of stress, anxiety, depression, possibly, with people potentially experiencing food insecurity or loss of loved ones, et cetera, et cetera. So those things need to be addressed in the context of the return to school, so that educators can be positioned then to provide for caring and supportive relationships with young people. And unless we do that, then the educators are not going to be well positioned. And I would extend that to youth workers as well. So I think those kinds of things warrant our attention, and we need to look at those things systematically and in a sustained way, because again, it's unclear exactly how this unfolds over time.
Yeah, I think the stressors that you're describing, and I think what we're asking of our teachers and of our school leaders right now is really unprecedented. And in addition to having some patience, I think we need to better understand this is some kind of new normal. What are the different skill sets that need to be in the curriculum, for example, for school leaders and teachers in the future, right? That we clearly hadn't prepared them for going into this pandemic.
There's just one other layer that I would add to that as well. You know, pre-COVID, we were also trying to address issues of implicit bias, et cetera, that undermine some of the student-teacher and student-student relationships in schools. And so that can be exacerbated in the context of pandemics, and especially the social unrest, where victim blame can be part of one's analysis. And so I think we're going to have to continue to help educators and young people wrestle with the kinds of inequities that we're seeing writ large in the society.
Yeah, it's clear that there are disproportionate effects here, right? And
yes.
We have to be incredibly intentional, I think, about how we're thinking and addressing that. Monica, you know, Bob was talking about peer networks and some of the utility we might see there. In your first slide, you talked about, in terms of a youth-centered focus, a sense of belonging and connection. Are there, he mentioned Americorps as one, expanding Americorps as one opportunity to do that. What opportunities do you see in creating better networks and chances for older students to be engaged with younger students, and vice versa, in focused on learning, but bringing that youth-centered focus and that need for belonging and peer interaction together? Are there real opportunities there, do you think?
I think it's an interesting question or area for innovation. And, you know, I think I'm on the same page with Bob, aware of that bill. And I think that that's a really important and tried and true, tested, proven strategy is through Americorps. I think we know of a few examples, and these really are sort of by zip code, of high school age students supporting middle school age students, and middle school supporting elementary school in some way. I think what I'm just going to be honest, I'm not totally familiar with the availability or widespread nature of those connections in a virtual setting, largely to what's already been discussed around these issues of scheduling and screen time, and how long can you really be in Zoom meetings as a 13-year-old. But it's certainly something that predates COVID. And I think the other element I would just add is that those are approaches that require a little bit of coaching and facilitation at the beginning. You can't just sort of say, here's some high schoolers meeting with some middle schoolers. And so just making sure that if to the extent it's a priority, is built into either this summer onboarding period or early in the year. I don't know, Bob may have more examples from adaptation to the virtual world.
So Bob, Monica just mentioned scheduling, and we got a question about scheduling. You mentioned that many schools are scheduled to have online instruction for a block of time, and then students are on their own. How is that model in terms of taking SEL into account, and what might be a better model for thinking about students' social emotional needs?
Yeah, so I think that, and again, the part of this was that, that the pandemic caught everybody by surprise, and people scrambled and tried to figure out what can we do with no planning, no warning. And that was really the spring. And it was like, at least let's provide some instruction. Let's do something. Where there's been much more of differentiation for the good and the bad is that since then, and since there's been more time, some folks were able to think about it and really reconfigure it and create a school day that's different, but still keeps all the elements of a school day. So there's still time for clubs, there's still time for advisories, there's still time for teachers and students to talk one-on-one. There's some very thoughtful examples out there at both the school and district level of how you can recreate the spaces for all those things to happen, even if they're done differently. And then there's other examples of folks that stuck with their April model and essentially is saying, we're going to have some instruction happen between 9 and 12, and after that, we'll give you some stuff to do on your own, and you're on your own. And we have not created the space for all those other structures to continue. I think some of those folks, to be fair, assumed school would open again, and they put all their work into opening school again. And then when that shifted quickly, weren't ready. But hopefully they'll be able to adapt quickly and move to some of those more better schedules that have been developed that really creates the opportunities for those things as best they can to happen virtually.
And I worry about how some of these schedules address the informal opportunities for a teacher and a student to engage in a classroom. Take a student aside after you see that he or she has been acting differently in class, asking them about questions in our video montage to start things off. Reports of abuse have gone way, way down. People are concerned about what that means because it's quite unlikely that the abuse has actually changed. It's just what we're noticing. So the opportunities for the trusted adult to engage with a student informally, I haven't seen a school sort of build that into a Zoom model in any kind of way.
Well, but this again is this point of you have to get to the awakening that stuff is necessary, not nice, and again, when you talk to kids, they will tell you how necessary it is. One of the things kids, they say they get frustrated is that they hear it once in the Zoom, they don't get it, they can't ask the teacher to explain it again. There may be a brief time for a group thing to ask questions, but they can't get to all the kids. The kids get very frustrated and sort of shut down. But some have found ways to build time into the schedule for private meetings with kids and students done appropriately to maintain that one-to-one contact on a more regular basis.
Yeah, that's incredibly challenging, but absolutely essential. So we've got just a couple minutes left, and I want to give our guests one last opportunity. Our series is focused on how COVID-19 is going to change schools now and after the pandemic. And so Monica, I'll go to you first. What do you see as some of the lasting consequences of the pandemic with respect to the role of schools in addressing social emotional learning and other important outcomes that extend beyond academics to what your group is calling, America's Promise Alliance is calling, youth-centered learning?
Sure. I think I share Bob's optimism that we are learning now the importance of attending to those what seem to be nice to have aspects of the learning environment, things like belonging and relationships between adults and between young people needing to be positive and needing to be anchored in knowing each other and knowing each other's full identities, which COVID has forced upon us. We now need to know, what is your health? What is your housing situation? Are you okay? And we're asking each other those questions, and we're asking young people those questions in a way we maybe didn't before. And I don't know how you go back from that. So I think I share that optimism that the human-centered approach to development and to young people that many of us would prefer to see in schools and out of school time environments is going to come. We're on our way, I hope.
Thanks, Monica. Bob, what about you? What are the lasting consequences you're seeing here, and how far does your optimism extend?
I mean, what I really see happening is that people that will come to just say, of course, when someone, like I would say, learning is social emotional. The science has been there for a decade. School practice has not, largely because teachers and many parents' lived experience with school did not support that. School was a place where you learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the rest was in the background. And this is really shown to teachers and parents that our emotions affect learning. It's a social process. When those are heightened, as it is for many kids who live in poverty every day, and that's the other thing, that what kids in poverty experience almost every day has now been more a widespread experience for folks. And hopefully that will have some lasting ramifications too, as far as some of our inequities and social justice. But on this idea that learning is social and emotional, yet people have viscerally experienced this now, both adults and teachers. And hopefully that will lead to a big mindset shift to say, then we have to worry about, are our kids emotionally supported? Are they socially connected? As being not nice, but necessary to really let them flourish as learners.
And Rob Jagers will give you the last word, lasting consequences. What do you think?
I think my colleagues hit on many of them. We, at the same time, can probably expect a little pushback on some of those ideas as well. I know that there's a lot of interest and energy around the notion of lags and slides and things like that. And that's based on a educational model that is not necessarily as humanized as both Bob and Monica have suggested. And so I think as, folks who are committed to the holistic development of young people, we need to, be prepared to offer the better idea so we can build back better and make sure that all young people get what they need and deserve.
Build back better. That's catchy, Rob. I think I might have heard that before, but I appreciate it. So great. Again, I want to thank our wonderful panelists for joining us. This has been a really fruitful discussion. I've learned a lot. I know the audience has benefited as well. We're going to continue on our series here of webinars examining how schools are being reshaped, hopefully for the better. We'll try to stay optimistic throughout around both during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to take Labor Day off, but please do join us in 2 weeks when we will consider voices of experience, real school practices during a pandemic. And we're going to discuss how teachers and school leaders have adapted and are trying to figure out how to navigate the various policies and pressures that are being placed on schools during this pandemic. We invite you to register for that upcoming session. Our guests on the 15th at 1 o'clock will be Sonia Santelises, who's CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, as well as Dr. Aaron Parsons, who's the Vice President for Kennedy's Krieger School programs here affiliated with Johns Hopkins University. So finally, I want to thank the School of Education team. A lot of folks working behind the scenes on this, making all of this look as good as it looks. Thank you for your tireless work on this. And thank you to the audience for joining us this afternoon. Again, my name is Christopher Morphew. I'm Dean of the School of Education. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to you continuing the conversation with us around impossible or imperative, how we're managing and reopening schools during this pandemic. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.